So I welcome you all as we settle into this space. And I invite you, although some of us have said where it is we're coming from, if you would like to put that in the chat so that we can see and say where it is you're from and on whose land you reside. If you know any of the indigenous names of the places where you are or the waters where you are, please add those as well. And for those of you who are coming to an alignment session for the first time, a warm welcome. This is a special place where we gather across different traditions and, as you can see, across many, many time zones in our dear world, bringing who we are to this space and hoping to be better kin and acknowledging that we all bring different stories and different ways of being. And so it is an absolute delight to welcome Patty Krawec into this space to share her story with us and to give us a chance to chat with her as well. So we will be recording this so that those who are in time zones that really don't work for them, although we're really glad some people are staying up in the middle of the night and getting up early to be here. Some other people will be joining to watch this recording and joining in conversation on Saturday. You're more than welcome to join that as well. But after Patty, after you give us some thoughts and things to think about, I'll turn off the recording so we all can be in conversation more informally. So gratitude to you all for being here and for creating this special space, and welcome, Patty.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I really like these kinds of groups because like I'll go on for a little bit and then we can kind of have conversation about what's happening. I love that we're from really all over the world. I mean, we got the Tasmania, which is like the other side, the whole other side of the planet. I just booked a trip to Thailand, so I'll be over on the other side of the Pacific. I'm pretty excited about being there. And Tasmania doesn't sound that far once you've already crossed the Pacific Ocean, but I won't be dropping down into Tasmania because I know it really is a bit of a distance. But that Pacific Ocean is huge. Anyway, so I'm zooming in from Niagara Falls, Ontario, which is where I have lived most of my life. It's shared land between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, who people may know as the Iroquois, but they call themselves the Haudenosaunee, and they're made up of 6 nations, which is one of the reserves nearby is actually called 6 Nations of the Grand River. So I'm going to see if I can remember. So we got Cayuga, Onondaga, Mohawk, Oneida. Yeah, I don't remember the other ones. Tuscarora and Seneca. There we go. I got them. And I think the Delaware were also brought in. So it's between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabe people. So it's shared territory. The Mississauga Anishinaabe are the people of the Big River mouths, and they're the ones who live down here in southern Ontario. And my people are Ojibwe Anishinaabe. So we are way north of we're kind of the northern area around Lake Superior and into Minnesota. That's where you'll hear like Chippewa, Salto. I think those are all part of the Anishinaabe group. And Margaret was just talking about Caitlin. We were just chatting a little earlier about Caitlin Curtis. Caitlin is Potawatomi. And so I think it's the Odawa, the Potawatomi, and the Anishinaabe. That's the Three Fires Confederacy. So, although Caitlin and I aren't part of the same tribal group, we are part of a group, that formed a confederacy, formed an agreement called the Three Fires Confederacy. So that's who I am. That's where I'm from. On my father's side, or sorry, on my mother's side, my mom is German Ukrainian, and my grandma was part of that group that was brought in by Catherine the Great to displace and replace the Ukrainian people because Ukrainian people are not seen very positively by the Russians. And she married two Ukrainians, actually one and then another when her first husband passed. And my grandfather, the man I knew as my grandfather, so my mom's father was the one who died, George Litnewski. But my grandpa, I always knew him as George Litnewski because he fled from the Red Army during the Second World War. And kind of refugeed, fled into Germany, found himself in American occupied Germany after the war ended, which was also where my grandmother wound up, was in American occupied Germany. She had fled Russia a few years earlier, and he had no papers. And so the lawyer, when they were, doing their immigration stuff, says, "Well, what do you have?" And my grandma says, "Well, I've got my husband's papers." And the lawyer said, "All right, I'll use those." And then that's how my grandpa, Zachariah Portienko, became George Litnewski. And so when I think about all of these relations, and can you imagine that living your whole life, not just under another man's name, which is, people do that, people change their names, but under the name of your wife's first husband? That always blows my mind, right? Because the ex or the dead husband is a big enough competitor, right? In terms of your wife's internal affections, or your spouse's internal affections, and what memories did she have of him, and the fact that his name was, he had to live his whole life under this other man's name. He's buried under this other man's name. Um, we only found out, like, we've always knew that his name, we always knew that he wasn't George Litnewski, but we didn't know anything more about him. Anyway, so I think about those relations a lot. I think about what connections they call me to. Um, I think about migrant justice a lot. A friend of mine is involved locally with migrant justice work, particularly around migrant farm workers, but also, more broadly speaking, about migrant justice. And so I think about that because my grandpa came here with false papers. My grandma knowingly facilitated him coming here with false papers. And, and so particularly right now, when we're talking about deporting refugees and closing borders, and Trudeau, and and kind of hit the waning light of his, because he's retired. He's not retired, that's the wrong word, resigned. So when the Liberal Party chooses a new leader, he will resign as prime minister and we'll get a new prime minister. But he's also, kind of rolling back, and the US right beside us is a big, like a major power. And with Trump coming in, Canada is falling in line with those immigration rules. They weren't so good under Biden either. But they're going to get worse. And so I think about that. Think about what's my responsibility as the child of migrants, as the child of people who came here, who came here desperate and willing to do that. And also my father's legacy, right? So it's my mother's legacy of being a good relative on, being a good relative on the land where I'm at, but also my father's legacy of being the original peoples of this place, and our original legacy of generosity and care and non-interference, and allowing the newcomers to come and live their own way. That was what the Haudenosaunee offered. And so thinking very carefully, and I think about that, also from a faith and Christian perspective, because we can colonize people spiritually, right? When we insist that everybody has to share the same belief, your belief might be great, but imposing a new belief on people is itself a form of colonization. And that's really hard for people who belong to a proselytizing faith. And I don't think Christianity is inevitably proselytizing. I think that's a lot of Western Christianity. And that's part of, I think, the inheritance from Rome, because Judaism is not proselytizing. If you want to become Jewish, you can, but you don't have to. Judaism understands multiple ways of, that God has multiple ways of relating to people. So I think this is more a legacy from Rome. The Christianity, that parts of some aspects of Christianity have taken on this need to convert the world. And we see that in the US a lot. I wanted to think about stones today. And it's kind of neat, Margaret, that we were talking earlier about Iona, because my son, one of my children lived in Ireland a few years ago. He went in on that young people's visa that just lets you go and live someplace and work for a little while. And so we went to go visit him, and on our way, we stopped at the Ring of Brognar up in the Orkneys. We went to go see those standing stones. We did not get to Stonehenge, but we also saw a ring of stones in Limerick, another ring of stones. And so I wanted to kind of start, and by start, we're already 10 minutes in, to reflect on two pieces so a piece from Becoming Kin, which some of you who have read the book might be familiar with, about, where I talk about stones, but also about a little bit from my next book, which is called Bad Indians Book Club. And that one just kind of really expands the way we think, the way we tell stories, not just about history, which is what Becoming Kin is about changing the way we talk about history, but the way we talk about science, the way we talk about gender, the way we talk about, the kind of memoirs we write, the fiction we write, the horror that the marginalized people write. Because of course, when you're pushed into those marginalized dark spaces, the things that scare you are not going to be the same things as the people that pushed you there. And so what kind of horror do we write? And how do we perceive horror or science fiction? How do we imagine ourselves in the future? And so that's it, so that's coming out this fall. It's not available for pre-order yet, but it should be very soon. I think we're just nailing down the cover. I think that's the only thing we're waiting for right now. So chapter 6 of Becoming Kin. So if you're not familiar with the book, Becoming Kin is really a deep dive of history. So for the first 5 chapters, we start with creation stories, and then we kind of move through colonization and residential schools, child welfare, missing and murdered Indigenous relatives. We kind of move through, the reservation system, all of those ways in which Indigenous peoples were moved off the land and displaced. And then there's a little interlude where I reflect on flood, and I needed a moment to breathe after writing all of that history. And so I kind of wrote this little interlude about a flood and about grief. And then we turn to rebuilding. And the first thing, of course, that we need to rebuild is our relation to land. And so chapter 6, called The Land, Our Ancestor, begins with a reflection about stones. So I'm just going to read from this. It says, "We begin with stones. In the Anishinaabe universe, even before the thoughts of Gishe Manadu, the creator or great mystery, there is what Louise Erdrich calls a conversation between stones. When I was in grade 9, my science teacher asked the class if stones were alive. We were learning the 7 criteria of life. After reviewing a list, we said no, stones were not alive. He asked us if we were sure. And so we went over the criteria again and told him yes, we were sure. He said that it could be that the stones did these things more slowly than we could measure. And then he said it could be that we lacked the ability to see these things in stone. It could also be that the criteria was wrong. And then he smiled. I don't think my teacher was suggesting that stones are alive. I think that what he wanted us to remember is that science is the asking of questions and the constant adjustment of what we think we know. Later in physics, we would learn about how some matter exists as both wave and particle, depending on how you look at it. Perspective matters. But this possibility of something like a stone being alive has stayed with me. Ojibwe Anishinaabe author and academic Lawrence Gross would agree with this science teacher. And in his book, Anishinaabe Ways of Knowing and Being, he writes about the Anishinaabe language being more suited for quantum physics than English is, because it understands the dynamic nature of creation, particle, and wave. It is a verb-based language, which talks about processes, what things do, rather than what they are. We are not human beings. We are humans being. For the Anishinaabe, stones may be alive. Our word for stone is asin, and it is animate. English is a highly adaptive and creolizing language, but it organizes the world into discrete subjects and then describes what those subjects are. So we shouldn't be surprised that our whole society is atomized into separate beings, separate things. Grammar often divides things into male and female, most obviously in languages like French and Italian, but English too is concerned with gender. And then every chapter of Bad Indians Book Club begins with a little piece of flash fiction. So that's something that I was playing with. And so Quay, we're coming up. This is, I think, the beginning just before chapter 2 or 3. So Quay is the Ojibwe word for woman. It's a kind of a broad understanding of woman. It could mean something like, people who carry feminine energy. It can include queer and trans people because the Ojibwe language doesn't have gendered pronouns. So like English and French have gendered pronouns. I once had a conversation with a trans person living in Quebec, just talking about the challenge of being non-binary, trans non-binary in a place where the language is as heavily gendered as French is, and the real challenge of that, although it's clearly a big challenge in English as well. But in Anishinaabe, we don't have gendered pronouns. We would say me, you, we, and that one over there. So there's no, so we do have male and female, but it's just understood very broadly. Quay is a deer woman figure. So she's, kind of human, but also can shapeshift into a deer. Anyway, so that's who Quay is. And so in this piece, she's on the East Coast. So Quay settled into the log beside her, stretching her antlers into the darkening night. She held a small round piece of granite in her hand, marveling at the depth of time and relationship needed to smooth the stone. The stone had found her on the shores of a great inland sea and had journeyed with her ever since. Although she sometimes traveled far from the vastness of this salted sea, she found herself returning to it after every journey. The stones in the outcropping not far from where she sat now had taught her stillness. It was a valuable teaching. In exchange, she returned often to tell them of other teachings. She told them about the things she had seen, other stones and rocks she had sat with. When she first came to the beach, she hadn't meant to stay so long, but the stones welcomed her. As she sat with them and listened, she felt herself changing, sinking into the stones. The change was not the quick transformation she had learned to control, but a slower change, as if she was absorbing the stones themselves. Soon she stopped moving altogether, and with them, she watched and listened. Aside from the stones, she was alone on that outcropping over the beach for a long time. Birds came and left. Mink ran back and forth. Raccoons peered at her curiously, as if they knew she was different from the other stones. Like the tides, people came and left. Centuries of movement in which the people and the landscape shaped each other's rough edges. The whole world moved, circling around her as if she alone were still, until the turning world brought the latecomers to her beach. Then everything changed. So it really puzzled me. In the beginning of that chapter about stones, where I say that Louise Erdrich talked about creation, how exactly does she say it? That before there was, even before the thoughts of Gije Manadou, there was a conversation between stones. And I didn't know what that meant. I thought it was beautiful and it fit nicely into the chapter, but I had no idea what it meant. And I was Googling it, and Google's only brought me to either Louise Erdrich or me quoting her. I asked, teachers that I had, Ojibwe teachers that I had, like, what is she talking about? And nobody had any idea what she was talking about. And I'm just going to grab something because Sorry. Sorry, this isn't exactly right, but it'll give you the sound. So normally, this sound would be made by a rattle, but this is the sound of creation. So it's a kind of a rattle. You have to imagine a rattle. This is not a rattle. These are jingles.
So
So,
Patty, if you turn your original
oh,
sound
sorry.
on, then we'll hear it.
I don't know if that worked. Anyway, okay, if that's not working, you guys know what a rattle sounds like. It's the sound of a rattle. The sound of creation is the sound of a rattle. And when my teacher said that, this woman I was doing a work, I was, we were having regular gatherings, and I had asked her about this thing that Louise Erdrich had said, and she says, I don't know what that, I've never heard that before. And then she goes on with her teaching about creation, and she says that creation was the sound of a rattle. And as soon as she said that, it clicked because the rattle contains stones. And so the sound, this before Gigi Manitou had his first thought about creating the universe, there was that conversation between stones. And I thought that was so beautiful and so perfect because for the Anishinaabe, stones are alive. And I see somebody in there is talking about Tyson Yunkaporta in his book Sand Talk, where he talks about that. He talks about stones being alive. So I know the Anishinaabe aren't alone in that. And I just came from a weekend of clan teachings where the Ojibwe teacher there was also talking about stones, and there are actually stone clans, but they're kind of secretive. You don't hear a lot about them. And so this, I want us to think about this idea of stones being alive and what that would mean for the way that we live, for the way that we think. I have stones with me. I have, like a lot of people, I brought them home from vacation. I don't do that so much anymore. Um, it wasn't that I had some kind of great epiphany and I was like, oh, stones are alive. I shouldn't bring them home. I just stopped doing it. And so I don't know if maybe that's some of the discomfort that Simon Yunkaporta talks about people experiencing when they steal rocks from heirs, from Uluru. And there's actually a shed there where people send them back. They're saying, oh, I've had nightmares ever since I brought this one home. Um, but we just the way we use them and build with them and we don't give them any thought. And we bring them home, we uproot them, and we decorate our homes with them. And I just found a box of stones in a closet. And if they're alive, how did they feel about being stuck in a box in a closet? And thinking about the memory that they have, the amount of things that they have witnessed. And I know the Bible also talks about stones and stone piles. And Moses struck that stone and broke it in half. And if stones are alive, that story makes a little more sense. He shouldn't have, he caused harm to a relative. And all of the different ways that the world is alive. And that's really what I wanted to get at in that chapter about land, was all those ways that the land is alive, is a collection of beings that are alive in their own right, and the waters that connect everything and the stories that these beings carry, these ancient beings. Like, what must our lives look like to them? The little short story about Quay, where she's sitting on the side, she's been running, traumatic event, and that was what kind of shifted her. She transformed into deer woman as the result of an intervention from a deer, and so and that is also traumatizing. And so she's doing a lot of running. And in this one chapter, she decides to learn stillness. And so she decides that the best people to teach her stillness are stones. And where this story actually came from was a woman that I knew decades ago. You play that game as, where would you travel back in time to? Where would you like to go? And so we were doing that. And she made a comment that she didn't want to travel to a time. She wanted to travel to a place. She wanted to sit on the eastern seaboard for 1,000 years and see who showed up. And so to honor her, that was what I did with Quay. But in order to have her sit on the beach of on the eastern seaboard for 1,000 years, she had to become stone. And the raccoons knew that she was not really a stone, that she was somebody else um, who had become stone. But yeah, that's where that part came from. But also, I think stones do have a lot to teach us about patience, about the work of of each other's. That granite stone that Quay is holding on to is one that I actually have. Um, that my husband, we'd gone camping around Lake Superior, and he brought me, there's a beach that's just full of these round granite stones. And he brought me one. And when he put it in my hand, I was like, oh, this one, this stone wants to come with me. This stone, we belong to each other. And so I have it and I hold it every morning when I say my prayers in the morning. And I'm thinking about stones a lot right now and what they may have to teach us and how can we sit with them and all of our different faith traditions and the way that we understand our place in the world. I think stones are a big part of all of those things. And I want us to pay attention to them, especially now in the winter. Well, in the northern hemisphere, it's winter. Tasmanian people, it's not winter. Um, but for us in the northern hemisphere, it's winter, and that's for the Anishinaabe a time of calming down and just, resting like the rest of creation under what should be a blanket of snow. Um, to kind of share stories and share memories and share time with each other. And so I was really happy to be invited at this particular season when we're supposed to be thinking and quieting our minds like the stones and thinking what we can learn from them and how we can, I don't know, bring them into our spiritual practice, use them to supplement our spiritual practice, think about the stones that are in our home, maybe the ones that are crushed into concrete for our patio, and just think about what that means that these are our relatives. Um, yeah, that's what I wanted to think about. So if people have questions or comments or other ideas, I can continue to think about stones and to talk about them, but we're a nice sized group. So if people have thoughts or comments or I don't know, you read Becoming Kin and it has absolutely nothing to do with stones, but you did have a question. Yeah, ask me. We'll do it. Ask me anything. But I'm mostly thinking about stones and snakes. I have snake earrings still. Snakes like to be on stones.
Thank you, Patty. I put in the chat there, I think some people on here know me well enough to know that my suitcase is, my pockets are filled with stones when I leave Iona every summer. And that's why I put this quote in there, because I just stopped cold when I read that part of your book. And I was saying in the chat, that was my absolute favorite part of your book was
Mm, mine too.
I could tell when you were talking about that. And I just wanted to say to everybody here, I did not prompt you to share that section, although I have written down in all the notes as I was reading your book for a second time, like stones, talk about stones. And I did not even prompt you to say
No, I
that.
would just, well, we must be
Yeah,
vibing
there was
now.
connection speaking there. Um, because the stones speak to me so strongly. And
Hmm.
um, and they speak to me when I'm there so strongly. And then I bring them here and they sit in a bowl and I add them to my bowl and they don't speak to me anymore.
Hmm.
And I've always thought of them as a reminder of what they were saying when I was there, that I brought them here so they might still speak to me. But I'm really rethinking that. They speak to me and they're alive when they're there, and I am displanting them. Um, so I may be carrying the stones back this summer.
Bringing them home. I had this story actually didn't make it into Becoming Kin. It made it into the first version, but it got cut because it takes place elsewhere. But when we traveled, we went to the two rock circles. We went to the Ring of Brognar, which is up in the Orkney Islands. Um, and then we kind of chanced across this stone circle out just outside Limerick. And the Ring of Brognar was interesting. It was awe-inspiring. Like these huge standing stones. I don't know. I mean, you can look them up on the internet if you haven't been there. The Orkney Islands are also beautiful. I went there because I thought they were connected to the Arthurian legend, which it's not. But anyway, still got to the Orkney Islands. Um, but they didn't feel like anything. And I didn't really expect them to. I was just, kind of awe-inspired by the height of them, by the age of them. Like they are awe-inspiring. But then as we were, as we chanced upon this stone circle in Limerick, I said, "Oh, I gotta go check out this stone circle." My husband stayed in the car, um, and I hopped out and I kind of grabbed just some small offerings, right? Some shiny things, because you never know when the Fae folk will show up and you want them to like leave you alone, so you gotta leave them shiny things. Or candy. I think they like candy. I think little people are alike all over the world. I think they like shiny things and candy. Um, the little people around here also like leather and needles because they like to make things and they like little tiny dishes if you have them. But all I knew at that time was shiny things like silver coins and candy. So I had some of that. So I brought it and a little bit of tobacco. I hoped that they understood Ojibwe people bringing tobacco. But when I stepped into that stone circle, they felt alive. Those stones felt alive. I felt it as soon as I stepped into the circle. It felt like electricity, I guess is kind of the best way to describe it. Like it was just the place was just vibrating. And as I walked around the circle, I understood why, because there was a fairy tree in the circle where the people had tied ribbons to. And there were flowers and trinkets left on all kinds of stones and in the crevices of the stones. And so these stones were alive because this stone circle was alive because people were engaging with it. People were visiting it. People were leaving offerings and forming, because that's what we do, right? Like I just had some friends come over and I gave them gifts. They gave me gifts when they came. When I go visit somebody, I bring a gift. I'm from the Niagara region. It's usually a bottle of ice wine, but that's what we do when we visit people. We bring a gift. We bring a plate of cookies or banana bread. Like we bring something. And so that's when I visited this stone circle, I brought gifts. And clearly a lot of people brought gifts because most of those stones had something on them. If it was possible to put something on the stone, it had something on it. And that was the difference between these, like as near as I can figure, between these two circles was one was gated off by ropes, so you couldn't get close to it. And the other was part of the community. And so it was alive. And the stones were alive. And these other ones, I don't know how you would wake them up. Maybe people need to sing to them. The old Irish songs. Maybe you should sing to your bowl of stones. Maybe you should do something to make them feel less homesick. I don't know.